The evening unfolded with a serene grace as the sun dipped behind the hills, enveloping our peaceful neighborhood in a warm orange embrace. In the kitchen, I busied myself with the evening meal, the gentle murmur of the radio wrapping the room in a soothing tune. Josh, my son, had just come back from college for the weekend, infusing the home with a soothing, familiar warmth. It was a tranquility born from the intertwining of shared memories and deep affection. As I stirred the pot on the stove, my thoughts drifted to the swift transformation of Josh, a journey that seemed to unfold in the blink of an eye. It feels as though it was merely yesterday when he was a curious little boy, following closely in my footsteps and bombarding me with a ceaseless stream of questions about the world around him. At the age of 21, he had shed the remnants of childhood. He stood before me, a young man exuding strength and confidence, though at moments he seemed unknowingly aloof. The interplay between us had evolved with his growth, a change that still seemed unfamiliar to me. As the aroma of dinner wafted through the air, I summoned him from the living room. As we took our seats at the table, I observed a distinct intensity in his gaze. It caused me to hesitate for a brief moment, yet I quickly set it aside, relegating it to the realm of mere imagination. Our dialogue unfolded effortlessly as we explored his classes, his friendships, and the deep sense of longing he felt for home. However, the way his gaze held mine, extending beyond the ordinary, ignited a feeling within me that eluded precise expression. Following our dinner, we chose to enjoy a movie together, a beloved ritual from the time before he embarked on his college journey. The living room exuded warmth, with its gentle lighting and plush cushions crafting a welcoming ambience perfect for a serene evening indoors. The memory of our last peaceful evening together eludes me, lost in the passage of time. As the film unfolded, I caught myself stealing glances at him, captivated by the transformation he had undergone. No longer the child I once nurtured, he had evolved into a man whose very presence commanded attention. Just as a peculiar unease began to settle within me, he inched closer on the couch. At first, I perceived it as something harmless. Perhaps he was merely in search of solace. Yet, as his hand grazed mine, a jolt of electricity surged within me, both fierce and unexpected. I swiftly withdrew my hand, taken aback by the profoundness of the moment. "What's the matter, Mom?" he inquired, his tone gentle and tinged with worry. I gazed at him, my heart pounding, uncertain of how to reply. "Nothing, sweetie, just tired," I replied, trying to brush away the palpable tension that lingered between us. Yet, beneath the surface, I sensed a change had occurred between us, a boundary breached that remained unspoken by either of us. The atmosphere was laden with unvoiced sentiments, and the film continued to unfold, yet neither of us seemed to be engaged any longer. I took my leave, asserting that an early night was in order. As I turned to leave, an unsettling awareness lingered, a sense that our bond had irrevocably shifted in that fleeting instant. That evening, as I reclined in my bed, my thoughts surged and swirled. It was clear to me that maintaining a certain distance was essential for the well-being of us both. Still, I found myself grappling with the complexities of this uncharted territory that lay between us. The following morning, I stirred from sleep with a sense of unease, the occurrences of the night before looping through my thoughts. I endeavored to persuade myself that it was merely a figment of my imagination. Ultimately, I was his mother, neither more nor less. My affection for him ran profound, yet it was a sentiment that could not be misinterpreted. I berated myself for my lack of reason. As I descended the stairs, I found Josh already awake, perched at the kitchen table, cradling a steaming cup of coffee. He welcomed me with a smile that implied all was right in the world, as though the events of the previous night had never occurred. Perhaps it had truly been inconsequential, a transient instance that I had blown out of proportion in my thoughts. "Good morning," I said, mustering a smile and striving to maintain an air of normalcy. "Morning, Mom," he replied, his tone relaxed and effortless. I found myself contemplating a hike later on. Care to accompany me? Shall we embark on a hike? It felt like an eternity since we had shared an experience like that. For a fleeting moment, I paused, contemplating whether it was prudent to immerse myself in his company once more, especially in light of the subtle tensions that had lingered from the night before. Yet, I found solace in the thought that it was merely a mother and son cherishing their time together. There is nothing amiss with that. Of course, that sounds lovely, I replied, yearning to capture the essence of the ordinary in our connection. In the later hours of the afternoon, we set off towards a familiar trail, a spot we had often visited during his younger days. The air was invigorating, and the sky radiated a stunning blue, creating an ideal setting for a refreshing hike. In that fleeting instant, all seemed perfectly aligned. We strolled together, engaged in a conversation that meandered through the corridors of nostalgia, touching on his aspirations ahead, the familiar rhythm of casual chatter enveloping us. A wave of laughter washed over me, a sense of ease settling in as I reflected on the previous night, wondering if perhaps I had let my emotions get the better of me. Yet, as we ventured deeper along the path, there were instances when our dialogue stumbled, creating a silence that hung in the air, more substantial than it ought to have been. Upon arriving at a clearing that unveiled a breathtaking panorama of the valley beneath, Josh halted and faced me, a change flickering across his features. "You've always been there for me, Mom," he said, his voice a gentle whisper, laced with sincerity. "Your presence is indispensable to me." His words carried a certain fragility, an unexpected honesty that struck me deeply and stirred a profound ache within my heart. I offered a smile, hoping to lift the atmosphere. "Oh, you can put that concern to rest for now," I quipped with a light-hearted tone. "I have no intention of leaving." Yet he remained silent, devoid of laughter. Instead, he moved in closer, his gaze capturing mine with a fervor that made my heart race. "No, I truly mean it," he persisted. "You have always been so much more than merely my mother. You have encompassed it all." I stood still, caught in a moment of sheer disbelief. His words lingered in the atmosphere, laden with significance that I was not prepared to face. I examined his expression, hoping to find evidence that he was merely indulging in sentimentality, that this was nothing more than a fleeting moment of tenderness. Yet, the gaze he cast my way hinted at a profound reality, one that sparked a whirlwind of feelings inside me. "Josh," I murmured, my voice scarcely rising above a whisper, "are you aware of the depth of my affection for you?" He responded, moving even nearer, as though challenging me to recognize the silent emotions that danced between us. "I cherish you deeply, perhaps even more than you understand." My heart raced. This was not the way a mother and son were meant to connect or regard one another. My thoughts clamored for retreat, urging me to create space between us, yet my body remained paralyzed, rooted to the spot. "I believe it's time for us to return," I murmured, my voice trembling. "The hour grows late." Just as I was about to look away, he extended his hand and softly grasped mine. The touch seemed innocent at first, but the way he lingered, the gentle caress of his thumb gliding slowly over my skin, stirred a confusing flutter in my stomach that was impossible to dismiss. "Mom," he murmured, his voice tinged with a feeling I struggled to identify. I find myself at a loss for words, yet there's an undeniable feeling that has taken root within me, one that perhaps you have sensed as well. A wave of panic washed over me. I withdrew my hand, stepping back, my heart racing within my chest. "Josh, stop," I urged, my voice quivering with emotion. "Surely, you can't be serious. Are you feeling perplexed?" He gazed at me, his face a tapestry woven with threads of confusion and pain. "I assure you, Mom, there is no confusion on my part. I am acutely aware of my emotions." "No," I replied, shaking my head in disbelief. "This feels off. You are my son. We are unable to proceed." I couldn't even complete the thought. The words hung in the air, laden with peril, too weighty to be spoken. Josh inhaled deeply, his expression shrouded in a veil of emotion. I understand that it may not be appropriate. Yet I find myself unable to control my emotions, and I suspect you might feel the same way. Emotions surged within me, threatening to spill over as I fought to keep my poise. This was not occurring. It simply could not be occurring. I needed to put an end to this before it progressed any further, before we ventured into territory that would forever alter our path. "I'm your mother," I said, my voice trembling. "And I cherish you, but not in that way. I am unable to do that. It is not possible." The words lingered in the air, heavy and oppressive. I could see the anguish reflected in his eyes, the way his shoulders drooped toward the ground. He inclined his head gradually, his gaze fixed on the earth beneath him, as though burdened by a sense of shame. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "It was never my intention to cause you any discomfort." I took a deep breath, forcing back the tumultuous blend of feelings churning within me. "It's all right," I murmured gently, even as uncertainty lingered in my mind. "Shall we make our way home now?" The journey back was enveloped in an oppressive silence. Neither Josh nor I uttered a single word. The gravity of the words exchanged on the trail lingered between us, elongating each fleeting moment into a torturous infinity. With my gaze fixed on the road ahead, my thoughts surged like a torrent, grappling with the whirlwind of events that had just unfolded. It was hard to fathom the words that had escaped his lips, the emotions he had laid bare. It seemed as though all my understanding of our relationship had been completely upended. As we finally rolled into the driveway, Josh quietly murmured something about retreating to his room. I let him go, watching as he vanished up the stairs. I sank into the couch, my body quaking with the torrent of emotions I had suppressed since that fateful moment on the trail. It was a puzzle that eluded my understanding. He had been my son, my precious baby boy, yet he was no longer a boy, and it was becoming alarmingly evident that our relationship had evolved into a complexity neither of us had anticipated. I yearned to convince myself that his emotions were merely a transient phase, a fleeting moment destined to fade with the passage of time. Yet, the intensity of his gaze, the lingering touch of his hand upon mine, conveyed a different story. A fragment of my being was steeped in guilt, as though I had inadvertently transgressed in some way. Perhaps I had shown too much affection, too much closeness throughout the years. Yet, it felt off, didn't it? Mothers were meant to envelop their sons in love, to nurture their spirits, to stand steadfastly by their side. That was all I had ever accomplished. Now, however, everything seemed overshadowed by the peculiar tension that had developed between us, leaving me uncertain about how to mend it. The remainder of the day was consumed by my efforts to evade him, immersing myself in chores and any task that might divert my mind from the tumult of emotions churning within. As the evening approached, a profound sense of emotional exhaustion washed over me. Though I was reluctant to face the reality of what had transpired, I understood that evasion was not a viable option for eternity. Josh and I could no longer maintain the facade that all was well when the truth was unmistakably different. That evening, after a restless battle with sleep for what felt like an eternity, a gentle knock echoed through my door. My heart plummeted. I was certain it was him. "Mother, may I enter?" Josh's voice carried a gentle timbre, tinged with a hint of uncertainty. I paused, my thoughts clamoring for me to refuse, to establish a barrier between us. Yet, I found myself unable to continue evading him. I found myself confronting this reality, regardless of the discomfort it stirred within me. "Come in," I whispered, propping myself up in bed and wrapping the covers around me as if they could offer protection from the emotional tempest that loomed ahead. Josh entered, his expression mirroring the turmoil and uncertainty that churned within me. He lingered at the threshold of the room, a momentary uncertainty enveloping him as he pondered his next move. Moments later, he lowered himself onto the edge of the bed, maintaining a careful distance. "I apologize," he murmured, his tone laden with remorse. "I regret the words I spoke earlier." Uncertainty washed over me, leaving me to ponder the sudden shift within myself. I nodded deliberately, sifting through my thoughts for the perfect expression. "I understand this may be perplexing," I said, "but what transpired earlier must not occur again. Josh. Caution is essential. This is not the way things ought to unfold. I know, he whispered, his gaze averted. Yet it feels so challenging, Mother. I'm uncertain about the reasons behind this feeling. I have made attempts to cast it aside, yet it relentlessly returns. His words resonated profoundly within me, evoking a deep and overwhelming sadness for him and for us both. Never had I envisioned finding myself in such a predicament, yet here we stood, caught in a tangle of feelings neither of us could decipher. I repeated, my tone soft yet resolute, I am your mother. That is the entirety of my existence. You're aware of that, aren't you? He gazed at me, his eyes brimming with anguish, yet he gave a slight nod. I understand, he replied. I simply cannot bear the thought of losing you. I promised him that he wouldn't lose me, but it was essential to establish some boundaries. This realm is fraught with peril. For a fleeting moment, silence wrapped around us, the remnants of earlier tensions still hanging in the air. Nevertheless, an implicit awareness lingered that the current state of affairs could not persist indefinitely. We were both aware of it, even if neither of us wished to confront the truth completely. Perhaps it would be wise for you to return to school tomorrow, I proposed softly. It seems that a bit of distance might be beneficial for us to gather our thoughts. He nodded with a deliberate slowness, yet the sorrow in his eyes was unmistakable. Indeed, he murmured softly. Perhaps you have a point. The following morning, I observed him as he gathered his belongings, the atmosphere around us heavy with unspoken feelings. I longed to embrace him, to offer the comfort of my presence and the promise that all would be well, yet I found myself unable to take that step, not after all that had unfolded. As he departed, an overwhelming sense of emptiness enveloped the house, more profound than it had been in years. I found myself perched on the couch, gazing out the window, attempting to unravel the complexities of it all. Though I was certain we had chosen wisely by creating some space between us, the reality of it weighed heavily on my heart. The bond that should have been straightforward and innocent between a mother and her son had transformed into a labyrinth of complexities, a situation neither of us was equipped to navigate. With each passing day, I endeavored to return to my familiar rhythm, yet everything felt altered. The silence of the house weighed heavily in Josh's absence, and my thoughts drifted to him more often than was perhaps wise. I hoped that the distance would serve as a balm, providing us with the necessary space to untangle our emotions. Yet, beneath the surface, I understood that the past would remain irretrievable. A change had settled between us, an alteration we could not reverse, leaving me uncertain about what lay ahead for us. I appreciate your time and attention as you engaged with my narrative. Be sure to subscribe for more captivating videos such as this one.